Hello, my friends, and welcome back to the book of 1 Samuel. Today we're going to be looking at 1 Samuel chapters 16 to 20, and we're going to pick up this story, which was, if we remember, last week we heard about King Saul, and Saul, of course, was the king that the people of Israel had demanded, and the one that God gave them. And Saul, while he initially was a good man and wanted to do what was right, he quickly stumbled, and he's already fallen, and he gave the sacrifice without Samuel there, and he has dishonored God, and God has now turned from Saul, and he will no longer be with him. And so, since God is no longer going to be with King Saul, he has to anoint someone else king, and that's what the Lord tells to Samuel, and Samuel goes to anoint King David. And so here's that story in chapter 16. So God sent Samuel to Bethlehem, and there he discovers David, the youngest of the sons of Jesse. It doesn't occur to anyone in the family that this shepherd lad might be a future king, but God sees things differently. In another remarkable statement, Samuel shows his deep awareness of the presence and perception of God. In chapter 16, verse 7, he says, "But the Lord said unto Samuel, Look not on his countenance or on the height of his stature, because I have refused him. For the Lord seeth not as man seeth, for man looketh on the outward appearance, but the Lord looketh on the heart." And so in this story, when Samuel is anointing David, or before he anoints him, he comes to Jesse and he goes through each of Jesse's sons, and it seems that each of them physically is more suited than David to be the king. But God says he doesn't look on the outward appearance; he looks at the heart. So Samuel anoints David by pouring oil over his head. The young man is filled with God's Spirit for the task of leadership. As the Spirit of the Lord comes upon David, so the Spirit leaves Saul. It's almost as though there is not enough Spirit to go around. But one day there will be, as the prophet Joel prophesies, and he says, "And afterwards I will pour out my Spirit on all people. Your sons and daughters will prophesy, your old men will dream dreams, your young men will see visions. Even on my servants, both men and women, I will pour out my Spirit in those days." And that's from Joel chapter 2, verses 28 29. So Joel looks forward to the era of Jesus. There will come a day of Pentecost when God's Spirit will no longer be restrained to an occasional priest or prophet or king, but freely given to all God's people. From now on, Saul is rejected by God, and he suffers with these fits of depression, and it even describes it as he's being like, he's basically dealing with it with an evil spirit like coming upon him. And so Saul is really going through these things, and he finds out that one of the things that really helps him is music. And wouldn't you know it, David is a excellent musician, and David comes and he plays the harp for King Saul, and it cheers him up and it helps with his moods. So the next story that we're going to see, starting in chapter 17, might be the most famous of all of King David's life. Probably is the most famous, at least of his positive stories, is David and Goliath. So this champion is needed to fight a giant Philistine called Goliath. David volunteers. So this should be Saul's task, since he is head of the army. He's the head of God's people. He is the king and has only one of the few suits of armor. But David goes out to meet Goliath armed with only faith in the living God and his shepherd's sling. This is more than a test of bravery. And I think what's pretty cool here is that David was willing to step up and fight Saul, and the reason he was willing was because, or not fight Saul, sorry, was willing to step up and fight Goliath. And the reason is because when David came to visit his brothers on the battlefield, he heard Goliath insulting God, insulting God's armies, and insulting God's people. And David is kind of like looks around and is like, "You guys are going to let this guy talk about God this way?" And everyone's kind of like, "Yeah, sure. What are you going to do about it?" And he's like, "Well, I'm going to go fight him because I got God on my side. God is with us." And that's an oversimplification of what happens, but more or less that is what happens. So David goes in, and he goes in with 5 slings, or not 5 slings. Goodness, sorry, it's late. He goes in with 5 stones and 1 sling, and he only ends up needing 1 stone to kill the great giant Goliath. And so This is more than just a simple test of bravery for David. It's a brave declaration that the God of Israel is greater than all other gods. As David says in verses 46 and 47, the whole world will know that there is a God in Israel. All those gathered here will know that it is not by the sword or spear that the Lord saves, for the battle is the Lord's. This is God's war. That's what David says. That's what he says when he goes into battle. And he goes into battle for the Lord, and it's a battle that it looks like on paper he shouldn't win. It's this little young shepherd boy against a seasoned warrior that's a giant. He's this massive mountain of a man. And David goes to fight against him. And as we know in the story, David wins. So after that, we really see Saul unravel pretty fast. And we'll see that in chapters 18, really 18 through 20, where we see Saul kind of fall apart here, where David is initially appointed to be a part of Saul's court. So he's somebody that's going to be around Saul all the time. And David still loves and respects Saul as God's chosen king, even though David had also been anointed as the king. I guess David probably just figured he meant that his anointing just meant that once Saul died of natural causes, he would take over. But David still respected Saul as the Lord's anointed king, and he wouldn't do anything to harm him. And we'll see that more as we get further into this story. So David, at first, he marries Saul's daughter, Michal, or Michelle, or however we want to pronounce that. And Saul's son Jonathan quickly becomes his closest friend. But the king himself is mad with jealousy. This is a warrior that went out and fought Goliath. Remember, it should have been Saul that went out to fight Goliath, but David did it instead. And David won, and the people knew it. And they walked around saying, Saul has killed his thousands, but David his 10,000s. And Saul knew this, he heard this, and he was jealous of it, and he wanted to kill David. And that's what we see in chapter 19, where Saul kind of like sets out to kill David, and he's just looking for an opportunity to do so. But because Jonathan and David were friends, Jonathan helped David, and we can see that starting in chapter 20, where Saul wants to kill David, and they come up with this covenant where Saul's going to basically let David know if it's safe or not to come around. And when Jonathan shows David that Saul does want to kill him and he needs to separate himself, David, he's brokenhearted because, remember, he still recognizes Saul as the king. Jonathan is his best friend, and he's also got Saul's daughter as his wife, who at this point he does still love. And so here we are with David stuck in this impossible situation through doing nothing but having faith in the Lord that Saul should have had, but he didn't. And so that's what we see here in this chapter, in these readings. And so make sure you take a look at those. And so what we've seen today is we've seen the story of David. He's anointed as king, and we see Saul kind of start to unravel and get to the point even where he wants to kill David because of his jealousy and because of his insecurity. And so that's not a good look for Saul, and things are just not going to get better for him. And so if we can take a lesson from this, it can be, look at how the jealousy corrupted Saul. Look what it did to him. Look what it did to his life. And it completely took him away from God. I mean, he'd kind of already been separated from God, and then he just transformed into this miserable person that was dealing with these bouts of depression and hatred and anger. And he was so caught up in being popular amongst the people as their king. And if he had just done his job and done what he was supposed to do, he would have been the one that was that popular. If he had just had faith in the Lord, it would have been him that had those things. But he didn't, and he didn't do what he was supposed to do. So we need to be careful when it comes to jealousy, because God does tell us not to covet. He tells us not to be jealous. He tells us not to do these things. We should be thankful instead for what God has given us, and to have faith that God will give us whatever we need when we need it. And so that's our lesson here from the book of 1 Samuel. And that's all for today. I will see you back here tomorrow in the book of Psalms.